The snow fell softly upon Hartfield Manor on the evening of December the 23rd, 1815, each flake catching the golden light that spilled from the grand windows and transforming the grounds into a scene from a winter fairy tale that Eleanor Ashworth observed with the detached appreciation of one who had long ago stopped believing in such fantasies. She stood in the small alcove off the main ballroom, her fingers resting upon the ivory keys of the pianoforte, a position she had claimed deliberately for its promise of invisibility. And she wore the faded lavender gown that had seen 3 seasons now, its colour grown soft and unremarkable, much like Eleanor herself, or so the whispers suggested. Around her neck hung her mother's pearls, the single concession Mrs. Helena Ashworth had made to her elder daughter's appearance this evening, though Eleanor suspected this had more to do with keeping up appearances before the county than any maternal tenderness. From her shadowed vantage point, Eleanor could observe the glittering assembly without being observed in return, a skill she had perfected over 27 years of existing at the margins of her own family's story. And she watched as her younger sister Lydia held court in the center of the ballroom, resplendent in ice-blue silk that caught the candlelight and scattered it like diamonds across the polished floor. Lydia laughed, and the sound carried across the room like music, drawing admirers closer the way flowers draw bees, and Eleanor felt nothing, or nearly nothing, just the familiar hollow ache that had become so constant she sometimes forgot it was pain at all. She had not attended a ball in 2 years before tonight, having retreated from society after her 25th birthday, when even her mother had finally stopped pretending there might be hope for a match, and she would not have come tonight, except that Aunt Catherine had insisted with that gentle firmness that brooked no argument. So Eleanor sat at the pianoforte and began to play, letting Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata flow from her fingers like water, like moonlight itself, and for a few precious moments she was not the plain elder sister, not the spinster aunt in training, not invisible at all, but simply music given form. She did not notice when the great doors opened to admit the newest arrival, did not see the way conversation stuttered and reformed around the entrance of Frederick Sinclair, Earl of Ravenscroft, recently returned from diplomatic service abroad and dressed in severe black that only emphasized the striking grey of his eyes, did not observe how every unmarried woman in the room seemed to stand a little straighter, smut a little brighter. But something made her glance up from the keys, some shift in the air, or perhaps the weight of attention. And for one suspended moment, her eyes met those of the dark-haired stranger who had paused at the threshold of the ballroom, his gaze directed not toward the glittering assembly or her beautiful sister, but toward the alcove where Eleanor sat with her hands still poised above the keys, and something flickered in his expression, something that looked almost like recognition, though they had never met. Then Lydia swept forward with her brilliant smile, and the moment shattered like thin ice, and Eleanor returned her attention to the music, telling herself firmly that she had imagined that pause, that glance, that fleeting connection that had felt strangely like being seen for the first time in years. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Half an hour had passed since the Earl of Ravenscroft's arrival, and Eleanor had watched from her alcove as the ballroom rearranged itself around him like iron filings drawn to a magnet, had observed how the matrons positioned their daughters in his path, and how the gentleman sought his attention with that particular deference reserved for men of both title and mystery, and through it all Lydia had remained at the center of his orbit, her golden hair catching the candlelight as she laughed and gestured with the easy grace of a woman who had never once doubted her own worth. Frederick Sinclair stood attentive at her side, his silver waistcoat gleaming beneath the holly garlands that adorned every pillar and doorway, and Eleanor told herself firmly that whatever she had imagined in that moment of his arrival had been nothing more than fancy, the desperate invention of a heart too long starved of notice. She let her fingers drift across the keys in something softer now, a gentle background melody that would not compete with conversation, and she watched as Lydia touched Frederick's arm with practiced intimacy. Watched as her sister leaned close to whisper something that made the corner of his mouth lift in polite acknowledgement, if not genuine amusement, and Eleanor felt the familiar ache settle deeper into her chest, like an old friend come to call. It was Charlotte Fairfax's voice that reached her first, carrying across the space between the refreshment table and Eleanor's shadowed corner with the particular clarity of gossip never meant to be overheard, yet somehow always audible to its subject. "Quite finished, of course," Charlotte was saying to her companion. 27, and not a prospect in sight, though I suppose someone must play the pianoforte, and it might as well be poor Eleanor. At least she has some use. Eleanor's fingers did not falter on the keys, for she had long ago learned to absorb such wounds without visible flinching. But something in her chest tightened as she saw Frederick glance toward the alcove again, his grey eyes searching the shadows where she sat, and she wondered what he saw when he looked this way, whether he saw anything at all, or simply registered the source of the music, before returning his attention to brighter things. She had her answer moments later when she heard him ask Lydia in a voice that carried just far enough, "Who is the musician playing this evening?" For the piece earlier was remarkably felt. Lydia's laugh tinkled through the air like breaking crystal as she replied with a dismissive wave of her gloved hand. "Only my sister Eleanor. She prefers shadows to society. You must not trouble yourself about her. She is quite content to be useful in her small way." Eleanor watched Frederick's expression shift. Something flickering behind his careful composure that she could not quite name, and she saw him glance toward her alcove once more with an intensity that made her breath catch, despite all her promises to herself, before Lydia reclaimed his attention with a question about Vienna, and his expression smoothed again into courteous attention, leaving Eleanor to wonder if she had imagined that flash of something that looked almost like displeasure at her sister's casual dismissal. The library was a sanctuary of shadow and firelight when Eleanor slipped through its heavy oak doors an hour later, having abandoned the pianoforte when she could no longer bear the weight of Charlotte's whispered cruelties, or the sight of Lydia's hand resting so easily upon Frederick Sinclair's arm. And she had not expected to find anyone here among the leather-bound volumes and the comforting smell of old paper, had counted upon this room being forgotten by guests who preferred dancing to reading, which was why she startled so visibly when a voice emerged from the darkness near the hearth, asking with quiet certainty whether she was the musician who had been playing Beethoven earlier. Frederick Sinclair stood beside the fire, his grey eyes catching the flame light as he watched her freeze in the doorway like a deer scenting a hunter, and Eleanor felt her heart stutter painfully in her chest as she clutched the book she had come to retrieve. Marcus Aurelius pressed against her bodice like armor, and she heard herself say in a voice that sounded nothing like her own that she was merely Eleanor, the elder Miss Ashworth, and surely he was looking for her sister, who would be wondering where he had gone. He did not move from his position by the fire, but something in his expression shifted as he regarded her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness, and he said simply that he was not looking for anyone, that he had come seeking quiet and found something far more interesting, for he had noticed the book in her hands and wondered if she truly read the Stoics or merely carried them for effect. The question should have offended her, would have offended her had it come from anyone else, but there was something in his tone that suggested genuine curiosity rather than mockery, and Eleanor found herself answering honestly that she found comfort in Marcus Aurelius, that his meditations on acceptance and dignity in the face of circumstances beyond one's control seemed particularly apt for a woman of 27, with few prospects and fewer illusions. Frederick was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling between them and the distant strains of a country dance floating through the closed doors. And then he quoted softly that the object of life was not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane. And Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest at hearing those familiar words spoken in his low voice, at being seen not as the plain sister or the invisible spinster, but as someone who might understand such philosophy. She found herself moving closer to the fire without quite meaning to, found herself speaking about the meditations with an animation she had not felt in years, her hands moving as she talked about duty and acceptance and the peculiar freedom of expecting nothing. And Frederick watched her with those storm-grey eyes and said quietly that she had speaking hands, that they told truths her careful words tried to hide. And Eleanor fell silent, suddenly aware of how close they stood, how the firelight painted gold across his features, how for one impossible moment she had forgotten entirely that she was nobody, and he was an earl meant for her beautiful sister. The afternoon of December 26th arrived with a grey sky pressing low against the window panes of Ashworth House, and Eleanor sat in the morning room with her embroidery frame balanced upon her knees, her needle moving through the delicate outline of a winter rose, while servants carried ash from the Yule log out through the back passages and stripped holly garlands from the mantels. And she tried not to think about the library conversation that had replayed itself in her mind 100 times since the ball, tried not to remember the way Frederick Sinclair had looked at her in the firelight, or the way his voice had sounded when he quoted Marcus Aurelius as though philosophy were a language they shared, tried most desperately not to hope, for hope was a luxury she had long ago learned she could not afford. He had called twice since the ball, arriving each time with impeccable courtesy to pay his respects to the family, and each time Eleanor had told herself that his presence in their drawing-room had nothing to do with her, that the way he maneuvered conversations toward topics they had discussed in the library was merely coincidence, that the way his grey eyes sought hers across the room was simply the habit of a diplomat trained to observe every face in attendance, and yet she could not quite silence the treacherous voice that whispered, "Perhaps, perhaps, perhaps," with every glance he sent her way. The sound of her mother's voice in the hallway made Eleanor's needle pause mid-stitch, and she heard Mrs. Ashworth's particular tone of triumphant excitement as she ushered someone into the parlour next door, and then came the deeper murmur of Frederick's reply, and Eleanor bent her head lower over her embroidery as her heart began to pound with an urgency she despised herself for feeling. She did not look up when the parlour door opened 20 minutes later, did not look up when her mother swept into the morning room with Lydia trailing behind like a golden comet, did not look up until her mother announced in ringing tones that she had wonderful news to share, that the Earl of Ravenscroft had declared his intentions to formally court their Lydia, that they could expect an engagement within the season if all proceeded as it ought. Eleanor's hands remained steady on her embroidery frame through sheer force of will, and she made herself smile and offer congratulations to her sister, made herself meet Lydia's eyes and see the triumph blazing there, the slight curve of satisfaction on her sister's rosebud lips as Lydia glanced at Eleanor with the certainty of a woman who had never doubted she would win any prize she desired. Frederick appeared in the doorway then, and Eleanor watched as something flickered across his features when their mother described how pleased he was to formalize his courtship, watched as his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when Lydia took his arm with proprietary ease, and for one terrible moment his grey eyes found Eleanor's across the room with an expression she could not read, an expression that looked almost like apology or desperation or grief, before he schooled his features back into pleasant neutrality and allowed Lydia to lead him toward the window to admire the winter garden. And Eleanor returned her attention to the half-finished rose beneath her needle and began carefully, methodically, stitching closed every door through which hope might escape. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors left out in the rain, each day bringing Frederick to Ashworth House with the reliable certainty of the tide, and Eleanor learned to exist in a state of perpetual awareness that exhausted her more completely than any physical labor ever could. For she was always listening for the sound of his carriage on the gravel drive, always arranging her features into pleasant neutrality before entering any room where he might be seated beside Lydia on the settee, always finding reasons to be present and yet invisible, helpful and yet unobtrusive, the perfect elder sister who fetched forgotten shawls and poured tea and turned music pages when Lydia condescended to play for their guest. Frederick brought her books, and this was the cruelest kindness of all, for he would arrive with volumes tucked beneath his arm and present them to Eleanor with a casualness that fooled everyone except perhaps Aunt Catherine, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, saying he had found this translation of Seneca and thought she might appreciate it, or mentioning that this collection of essays had reminded him of their conversation about duty and desire, and Eleanor would accept each book with steady hands and murmured thanks, while something inside her chest cracked a little wider with every gift. She hid them in the library, these dangerous treasures, tucking them behind larger volumes where no one would think to look, and sometimes late at night she would retrieve them and trace her fingers over the pages he had touched, reading his margin notes in the candlelight and feeling closer to him in those solitary moments than she ever allowed herself to feel when he sat across from her in the drawing-room with Lydia's golden head tilted toward his shoulder. He laughed only with Eleanor, and this too was torture, for Lydia would chatter brightly about bonnets and balls and the latest gossip from Charlotte Fairfax, and Frederick would nod and make appropriate sounds of interest, but his face remained pleasant and distant until Eleanor said something quiet and dry from her corner chair, some observation about the absurdity of society or the hypocrisy of convention, and then his grey eyes would find hers, and his lips would curve into a genuine smile, and laughter would escape him before he could catch it, and Eleanor would look away quickly because she could not bear the weight of Lydia's irritated glance, or the knowledge that these moments belonged to her alone. Lydia complained constantly now, telling Charlotte within Eleanor's hearing that Frederick was dreadfully serious, that he never wanted to dance or gossip or do anything amusing, that she sometimes wondered if he had any feelings at all beneath that handsome face. And Eleanor stitched the final petals of her winter rose embroidery, and said nothing, though her needle shook slightly at the injustice of it all. The snowdrops appeared in late February, pushing through frozen ground with stubborn determination, and Eleanor watched them from the morning-room window while Frederick sat beside Lydia discussing wedding dates, and she thought that flowers were braver than she would ever be, reaching toward light despite the cold, while she remained rooted in shadow, loving a man she could never claim. The afternoon of March the 15th arrived with the first true warmth of spring, and Eleanor found herself walking the garden paths behind Ashworth House with her grey pelisse buttoned against a breeze that still carried winter's memory, her boots crunching softly on gravel while early crocuses pushed purple and gold through the dark earth along the borders, and she had come outside to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the drawing-room where Lydia sat with their mother discussing wedding dates and trousseau requirements as though the engagement were already a settled matter rather than an expectation hovering just beyond reach, and Eleanor needed air, needed space, needed a moment away from the constant awareness of Frederick's presence in her home, where he sat making polite conversation while his grey eyes followed her movements with an intensity she could no longer pretend not to notice. She did not hear him approach until his voice came from behind her, low and urgent in a way she had never heard from him before, and she turned to find Frederick standing on the path with his dark hair disordered by the wind and his expression stripped of the careful, diplomatic neutrality he usually wore like armor, and something in his face made her heart stutter painfully against her ribs as he said her name, Not Miss Ashworth, but Eleanor, and the sound of it on his lips felt like a door opening onto a room she had forbidden herself to enter. He asked if he might sit with her on the garden bench, the stone seat tucked beneath the old apple tree where she had spent countless hours reading in summers past, and Eleanor knew she should refuse, knew that every moment alone with him was a wound she inflicted upon herself. But she nodded and settled onto the cold stone, while he sat beside her close enough that she could smell the sandalwood of his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his shoulder near hers. He was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped between his knees, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion as he said that he had been trying to find the words for weeks, that there was something he needed to tell her, something that could not wait any longer. And Eleanor felt her breath catch as he turned to face her, with those grey eyes blazing with an intensity that terrified her. And he began to say, "Miss Ashworth, I must tell you that when Lydia's voice rang out across the garden, bright and sharp as breaking glass, calling for Frederick with the petulant insistence of a woman who expected to be obeyed, and Eleanor watched as something shattered behind his eyes, watched as his jaw tightened and his hands clenched into fists upon his knees before he rose with mechanical courtesy to acknowledge Lydia's approach. Eleanor remained on the bench as Lydia claimed Frederick's arm and led him back toward the house, chattering about wedding invitations and guest lists, and she told herself that she had misread the moment, that he had surely been about to warn her that their conversations must cease, that she must keep proper distance from her sister's intended, and this interpretation hurt less than hope would have hurt. So she wrapped it around herself like her grey pelisse and sat alone among the crocuses until the cold finally drove her inside. The spring ball at Hartfield Manor arrived on the evening of April 3rd, with all the cruel beauty of a season that cared nothing for broken hearts, and Eleanor stood in the same alcove where she had played the pianoforte on that December night that now felt like another lifetime, watching the ballroom transformed from winter's holly and candlelight into a bower of forced blossoms and the promise of warmer days. And she told herself that she had prepared for this moment, had armored herself with weeks of quiet acceptance since that afternoon in the garden when Frederick's unfinished sentence had died on his lips, and she had convinced herself he had been about to warn her away rather than draw her close. And yet no amount of preparation could truly shield a heart from watching the man it loved kneel before another woman. Frederick had received a letter from his mother 3 days prior, Lydia had announced triumphantly at breakfast, a letter urging swift action before the Dowager Countess's failing health prevented her from witnessing her son's happiness. And Eleanor had nodded and smiled and excused herself to vomit quietly in the garden behind the roses where no one could hear, and now she stood in her alcove wearing a gown of dove-grey that her mother had criticized as funereal, and watched as the guests gathered in a loose circle around Lydia, who glowed in pale pink silk like the dawn of a day Eleanor would not survive. Frederick entered the ballroom with the measured stride of a man walking toward his own execution, his dark evening clothes immaculate, his face arranged into an expression of pleasant anticipation that did not reach his grey eyes, and Eleanor watched him cross the polished floor toward Lydia, while the crowd parted before him like water before a ship's prow, and she gripped the windowsill behind her until her knuckles went white beneath her gloves, because she could not look away, could not spare herself this final wound. He knelt before Lydia with the grace of long practice at diplomatic ceremonies, producing a ring box from his pocket that contained the Sinclair sapphire, a stone the color of winter twilight that had adorned the hands of countesses for 6 generations, and his voice carried across the hushed ballroom as he spoke the words that would bind him to her sister forever. And in the moment before Lydia's triumphant yes rang out like a bell, Frederick's eyes lifted from his intended bride's face and found Eleanor's across the crowded room, and in that single heartbeat She saw everything he could not say, every unspoken confession, every buried longing, every desperate wish that circumstances had been different. And then Lydia's acceptance shattered the moment, and the crowd erupted into applause, and Eleanor slipped through the garden door behind her into the cool April night, where spring flowers perfumed the darkness, and she finally allowed herself to break into pieces that no one would ever see. The days that followed the spring ball passed like a fever dream for Eleanor, each hour stretching into eternity as she moved through Ashworth House like a ghost haunting the rooms where her heart had quietly died, and she took her meals in her chamber when she could manage it, pleading headaches and fatigue that her mother dismissed as dramatic nonsense, unbecoming a woman of her age, though Aunt Catherine's knowing eyes followed her with concern whenever they crossed paths in the corridor, and Eleanor spent the hours between dawn and dusk, packing her books into trunks she had retrieved from the attic, wrapping each beloved volume in cloth, as though preparing them for a journey she had not yet announced, but had already decided upon in the shattered aftermath of watching Frederick place the Sinclair sapphire on her sister's finger. The household transformed around her into a temple of wedding preparation, with fabric samples arriving daily in shades of ivory and cream and pearl, and seamstresses appearing at all hours to measure Lydia for the gown that would make her a countess. And Eleanor smiled when required, and offered opinions when demanded, and retreated to her chamber the moment she was no longer needed. And it was there that Frederick's letter found her on the 4th day after the engagement, slipped beneath her door by a servant who did not know the magnitude of what he carried. And Eleanor held the sealed paper in her trembling hands for a full hour before she placed it unopened in the fire, and watched the edges curl and blacken without reading a single word, because she knew with terrible certainty that whatever comfort or explanation or apology those pages contained would only make the leaving harder. Frederick came to call every afternoon that week, ostensibly to see his intended bride, but Eleanor heard from the servants that he asked after her health, inquired about her whereabouts, lingered in doorways hoping for a glimpse of the sister who had become expert at disappearing. And once she watched from the upstairs window as he stood in the garden staring at the bench beneath the apple tree, where he had almost told her something that might have changed everything, and the rigid line of his shoulders spoke of a despair that matched her own. But she turned away because his pain was not her burden to carry. Not any more. On the 10th day she descended to the drawing-room where her parents sat with Lydia reviewing invitation lists, and announced in a voice that did not waver that Aunt Catherine had invited her to Bath for an extended visit, and that she intended to leave within the week, and her mother's relief was palpable. One less spinster daughter cluttering the house during wedding preparations, while her father's mild protest died quickly under his wife's quelling glance, and only Lydia looked up with something like suspicion flickering in her blue eyes before she shrugged and returned to debating whether the Fairfax family deserved an invitation after Charlotte's recent slight, and Eleanor climbed the stairs to finish her packing with the taste of freedom bitter as ash upon her tongue. The morning of April 15th arrived wrapped in the grey gauze of spring rain, and Eleanor descended the stairs of Ashworth House at 6 in the morning, while the household still slept, carrying only a small valise containing her most treasured possessions, because Aunt Catherine's servants had loaded her trunks the evening before under cover of darkness, as though Eleanor were a thief stealing away with her own broken heart. And she paused in the entrance hall, where the grandfather clock marked the hour with solemn chimes that seemed to echo through the empty rooms like a funeral toll, and she allowed herself one final moment to look upon the home where she had spent 27 years learning to be invisible, to take up no space, to want nothing that might inconvenience others. And she found that the ache she expected was dulled by exhaustion into something almost bearable, a hollow resignation that would have to suffice for courage. She moved through the silent house like a spectre visiting familiar haunts. Her fingers trailing along the banister she had descended 1,000 times, past the drawing room where her mother held court and the morning room where Lydia practiced her accomplishments for admiring audiences. And finally she slipped into the library where the fire had long since died, and the books stood sentinel in their shelves waiting for a reader who would not return. And it was there that she realized she had left something behind. Her embroidery of the winter rose that she had completed during those torturous months of watching Frederick court her sister. The delicate needlework she had poured her unspoken feelings into stitch by careful stitch and she retrieved it from the basket beside her favorite chair and held it in her hands for a long moment before placing it deliberately on the reading table where Frederick always sat when he visited. A silent farewell he would probably never understand. And then she walked out into the rain where Aunt Catherine's carriage waited like a promise of escape. The coachman helped her inside with quiet efficiency, and as the horses began to move and Ashworth House receded into the mist behind her, Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and watched her childhood home disappear. And she did not see the rider who came thundering down the lane 10 minutes later, his dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain, his grey eyes wild with desperation as he threw himself from his horse and burst through the front door, only to find the library empty, save for a piece of embroidery lying on a table like an accusation. And Frederick Sinclair, Earl of Ravenscroft, sank into the chair that still held the faintest trace of her warmth, and gathered the winter rose to his chest, as the rain streaked down the windows like the tears he could not shed, understanding at last, and far too late, that he had let the only woman who had ever truly seen him slip through his fingers while he performed duty for an audience that did not matter. The first weeks in Bath passed in a blur of grey mornings and restless nights as Eleanor drifted through Aunt Catherine's elegant townhouse like a woman recovering from a long illness. And her aunt asked no questions, but simply ensured that tea appeared at regular intervals and that the fire in Eleanor's chamber never died. And slowly, so slowly that Eleanor did not notice the change until it had already begun, the sharp edges of her grief began to soften into something more bearable, a dull ache rather than the searing agony that had driven her from home. By May, the assembly rooms had opened for the season, and Aunt Catherine gently insisted that Eleanor accompany her to a concert, featuring a pianist whose interpretation of Mozart reminded Eleanor that music still existed in a world that had felt colourless since April, and she found herself weeping silently in the darkened concert hall, not from sorrow but from the unexpected sweetness of beauty reclaimed. And afterward a widow named Mrs. Drummond introduced herself and declared that anyone who wept at Mozart must have a soul worth knowing, and this was how Eleanor acquired her first friend in Bath. June brought new gowns that Aunt Catherine commissioned despite Eleanor's protests, fabrics in rich burgundy and deep forest green that her mother would have declared far too bold for a plain spinster. But Aunt Catherine merely smiled and said that Bath had different rules and that Eleanor had hidden in shadows long enough. And when Eleanor looked in the mirror, she saw someone she barely recognized, a woman with warm brown eyes that held depth rather than defeat. And she began to understand that perhaps invisibility had been a choice she no longer needed to make. The summer months unfolded like pages of a book she was finally allowing herself to read, filled with literary discussions in Mrs. Drummond's drawing room and philosophical debates with a retired professor who declared Eleanor's mind sharper than half his former students. And in July she began writing poetry in a leather journal she kept hidden in her bedside drawer, verses about winter roses and unspoken words and love that bloomed in the wrong season, and the act of putting ink to paper felt like releasing something that had been trapped inside her chest for months. Aunt Catherine found her writing one August afternoon and said nothing except that some feelings were too large for silence, and Eleanor did not know that 200 miles away, Frederick Sinclair sat in his study surrounded by letters he would never send, pages filled with apologies and confessions and desperate questions about whether she was well, whether she was happy, whether she ever thought of a library conversation that had changed everything. And Lord Beaumont, who visited weekly, watched his friend deteriorate beneath the weight of an engagement that felt more like a prison sentence with each passing day. And the autumn wedding date approached like a storm on the horizon that neither man knew how to stop. The carriage bearing Eleanor back to Ashworth House arrived on the afternoon of October 1st, beneath a sky the colour of old pewter, and the autumn leaves swirled around the wheels like whispered warnings as she pressed her gloved hand against the window and watched her childhood home emerge from the avenue of oaks that had witnessed her departure 5 months earlier, when she had been a woman held together by nothing but determination and the desperate need to escape. And now she returned as someone different, someone who had learned in Bath that invisibility was not an immutable state, but rather a cloak she had worn so long she had forgotten it could be removed. And Aunt Catherine squeezed her hand and murmured that she need only say the word, and they would turn back to Bath, and propriety could hang itself. But Eleanor shook her head because she had promised her father, and because some part of her needed to prove that she could stand in the same room as Frederick Sinclair and watch him marry her sister without shattering into pieces on the church floor. The household erupted into activity at their arrival, with servants carrying trunks, and her mother emerging to exclaim over how well Eleanor looked, while simultaneously noting that burgundy was rather a bold choice, and had she gained weight in Bath, and Lydia swept down the stairs in a flurry of complaints about ribbon deliveries and uncooperative modistes, and barely spared Eleanor a glance, beyond remarking that at least someone was finally here to help, because she was simply exhausted from all the preparations. And it was into this chaos that Frederick Sinclair walked through the front door on an errand regarding the wedding breakfast arrangements, and for one crystalline moment the world stopped spinning as his grey eyes found Eleanor standing in the entrance hall in her new burgundy travelling dress, with her hair styled in the softer fashion that Mrs. Drummond had insisted suited her face. And she watched something shatter and rebuild itself in his expression as he took in the changes that 5 months had wrought, the quiet confidence in her posture, the calm steadiness of her gaze that no longer slid away from his in practiced deference, the way she inclined her head in polite acknowledgement, as though he were merely an acquaintance, and not the man whose memory had haunted every poem she had written in her hidden journal. Frederick seemed unable to speak for a long moment, his face pale beneath the tan he had acquired from long rides across his estate. And when he finally managed to say, "Welcome home, Miss Ashworth," his voice emerged rough and strange, and Lydia immediately claimed his attention with a litany of grievances about the florist, while Aunt Catherine watched the entire exchange with knowing eyes, and later told Eleanor that if that man married Lydia Ashworth, it would be the greatest tragedy she had witnessed since the Revolution in France. And Eleanor replied that some tragedies were simply the price of honour, though her hands trembled as she unpacked her poetry journal and hid it beneath her pillow, where no one would ever find the evidence of her breaking heart. The week that followed Eleanor's return unfolded like a slow torture designed by fate itself, each day bringing fresh opportunities for the paths of Eleanor and Frederick to cross, in ways that left her breathless and desperate to maintain the composure she had cultivated so carefully in Bath, and she threw herself into wedding preparations with a determination that bordered on manic, arranging flowers and addressing invitations and consulting with the modiste about Lydia's veil, as though burying herself in details could somehow protect her from the grey eyes that seemed to find her in every room she entered. On the morning of October 8th, Frederick appeared in the breakfast room where Eleanor sat alone reviewing the seating arrangements for the wedding breakfast, and instead of retreating as propriety demanded, he pulled out the chair beside her and asked in a low voice what she had been doing in Bath all those months. And she replied, organizing Aunt Catherine's correspondence, which was not entirely untrue, but he studied her face with an intensity that made her hands tremble, and said he had heard she spent considerable time writing, and her heart seized because no one should have known about the poetry. And when she denied it, her voice emerged too quickly, and he smiled that rare half-smile that had haunted her dreams, and said that Mrs. Drummond had written to a mutual acquaintance praising Miss Ashworth's remarkable verses about winter roses. The admission, when it finally came, felt like surrender, as Eleanor confessed that yes, she had written some poetry merely as a diversion, and certainly nothing worth reading, and Frederick leaned closer and asked if he might see it, and she refused with more vehemence than the question warranted, her cheeks flushing as she gathered the seating charts and fled to the safety of the morning room, where Lydia immediately demanded to know why the lilies had not yet arrived, and whether Eleanor had confirmed the musicians, and honestly, could no one in this household manage anything without constant supervision? The days blurred together in a haze of last-minute alterations, and temperamental bakers, and Lydia's increasingly sharp tongue, as she complained to Charlotte Fairfax that Frederick had been positively glacial during their walk yesterday, and that he seemed more interested in discussing philosophy than in admiring her trousseau, and Eleanor overheard this from the hallway and pressed her hand against her chest, where something ached beneath her ribs. On October the 12th, Frederick cornered her in the library, where she had gone to escape the chaos, and asked again about the poetry. And this time there was something raw in his voice as he said that he needed to know what she had been thinking all those months, what words she had found for feelings that he himself could not articulate. And Eleanor clutched her composure like armor and told him that some thoughts were meant to remain private, and he stepped closer and whispered that privacy was a luxury he could no longer afford, and she did not understand what he meant until Aunt Catherine appeared in the doorway, and Frederick stepped back as though burned, while somewhere in the distance Lydia's voice rose in yet another complaint about ribbon colors. The wedding eve dinner on October the 14th unfolded with a brittle gaiety that fooled no one who cared to look closely. The dining room ablaze with candles, and the table groaning beneath dishes that Eleanor could not taste, as she sat in her customary place at the far end, while Lydia held court beside Frederick, whose face had taken on the quality of carved marble, and when the final course was cleared, and her mother proposed a toast to the happy couple, Eleanor felt something crack behind her ribs, and excused herself with murmured apologies about needing fresh air, slipping through the French doors into the October garden, where the last roses clung to their stems in defiance of the coming frost, and the same bench where Frederick had almost spoken all those months ago waited beneath the skeleton branches of the old oak tree. She did not hear him follow, but she felt his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure, the way the air itself seemed to thicken when he drew near, and when he said her name, not Miss Ashworth, but Eleanor, she closed her eyes against the intimacy of the sound and told him he should return to his betrothed, and he replied that he could not spend another moment pretending when tomorrow would seal a fate he had never truly chosen. And she turned to face him. Then, seeing in the moonlight that his composure had finally shattered, his grey eyes wild with something that looked like desperation, or perhaps liberation, he told her everything in a rush of words that seemed to have been dammed behind his teeth for months, that he had known since the Christmas ball, when he heard her playing and felt something shift in his chest, that every moment with Lydia had been an exercise in endurance, while every stolen conversation with Eleanor had been the only truth in his manufactured courtship. That he had written her dozens of letters in Bath, confessing everything only to burn them because he had no right to burden her with feelings that circumstance had made impossible. And when he said it has always been you, Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks because she had spent nearly a year telling herself she had imagined the connection, and here he stood, offering confirmation of everything she had forbidden herself to hope. But even as her heart cracked open, she found herself shaking her head and stepping backward, because she knew what honor demanded, and she told him that he had given his word, and that Lydia expected him at the altar tomorrow, and that she would not be the reason he became a man who broke sacred promises. And Frederick reached for her hands and held them between his own, and asked if she truly expected him to marry a woman he did not love, while the woman who held his heart stood witness to the ceremony. And Eleanor whispered that expectations had governed her entire life, and that sometimes duty was all that remained when love became impossible. And she pulled her hands free and fled back toward the house before her resolve could crumble, leaving Frederick standing alone beside the dying roses, with the weight of tomorrow pressing down upon them both like a sentence already pronounced. The morning of October 15th dawned grey and cold, as Eleanor rose from a bed where sleep had never truly found her. Her eyes, swollen from hours of silent weeping, pressed into her pillow where no one could hear the sounds of her heart breaking. And by 9 o'clock she stood in Lydia's chamber, performing the final duty that sisterhood demanded, as she wove orange blossoms into her sister's golden hair with fingers that trembled only slightly, a betrayal she concealed by keeping her hands moving constantly through the gleaming tresses, while Lydia prattled about the breakfast menu and whether the weather would hold, and how Frederick had seemed rather strange at dinner last evening, though, of course, all bridegrooms grew nervous, and Charlotte Fairfax's brother had apparently been sick with anxiety before his wedding, so really it was quite flattering when one thought about it properly. Eleanor made appropriate sounds of agreement, while her mind replayed every word Frederick had spoken in the garden, the raw confession that had confirmed everything she had forbidden herself to believe. And she wondered how she would survive the next 2 hours standing in that church, watching the man she loved bind himself to another woman, watching him speak vows that should have been impossible after what had passed between them beneath the dying roses. And yet she knew with terrible certainty that he would do his duty because she had demanded it of him, and because honor was the architecture of his character, even when honor required the demolition of happiness. The wedding dress lay across the bed like a sacrifice, ivory silk and Brussels lace that their mother had commissioned from London at tremendous expense. And when Eleanor helped Lydia into the elaborate creation, she felt as though she were dressing a lamb for some ancient ritual, beautiful and doomed in ways the lamb could never comprehend. For Lydia remained blissfully ignorant of the confession in the garden and the devastation it had wrought upon both the man she would marry and the sister who fastened her buttons with steady hands and a shattered soul. At 9:30, the household erupted into final preparations, their mother issuing commands like a general marshalling troops, while their father stood bewildered in his best coat, asking whether anyone had seen his spectacles. And through it all, Eleanor moved like a ghost, performing tasks she would not remember, adjusting Lydia's veil and locating the missing prayer book, and assuring Charlotte Fairfax that yes, the flowers at the church would be magnificent, and yes, Lydia made the most beautiful bride the county had ever seen, and if her voice emerged hollow and strange, no one noticed, because no one ever noticed Eleanor. Not truly, except for one man who had seen her from the very beginning, and who at this moment was presumably dressing for his own execution in the Ravenscroft townhouse across the village, while Lord Beaumont offered whatever comfort could be found for a bridegroom who had confessed his love to the wrong sister mere hours before he was required to marry the right one. The carriage procession to St. Michael's Church began at 10:30, the grey October sky pressing down upon the assembled family like a physical weight as Eleanor climbed into the second carriage with Aunt Catherine, while Lydia travelled in bridal splendour with their parents in the first. And through the window, Eleanor watched the familiar countryside roll past with the detachment of someone already departed, already gone from this place in every way that mattered, even as her body remained trapped in ivory muslin and the cameo brooch Aunt Catherine had pressed into her hands that morning with a look of such profound understanding that Eleanor had nearly broken down entirely. The church appeared through the bare trees, its ancient stone walls draped in late autumn ivy, and the doors thrown open to receive the guests who had gathered from across the county to witness the Earl of Ravenscroft claim his bride, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench as she stepped down from the carriage and saw the crowd already assembled inside. The whispers that followed her entrance, a familiar chorus of pity and dismissal as she took her place in the family pew near the front, where she would have an unobstructed view of everything she could not bear to see. Frederick stood at the altar with Lord Beaumont beside him, and even from this distance Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained clasped behind his back, as though he were restraining himself from some action that propriety forbade. And when his grey eyes found hers across the flower-bedecked church, she saw something that might have been apology, or desperation, or farewell, a look so raw that she had to drop her gaze to the prayer book in her lap before she shattered entirely. The music swelled as Lydia appeared in the doorway, a vision in ivory silk and Brussels lace with orange blossoms crowning her golden hair, and the congregation rose as one to witness her progress down the aisle on their father's arm, and Eleanor rose with them, though her legs trembled beneath her borrowed strength, and her heart beat with such violence she feared the congregation could hear it over the organ's triumphant processional. Lydia reached the altar, and their father stepped back, and Frederick turned to face his bride. And Eleanor watched his profile as the vicar began the familiar words, the ancient ceremony that would bind these two people together until death. And she thought she saw Frederick's jaw tighten when the vicar asked if anyone knew of any impediment, a moment that stretched into eternity before silence confirmed what everyone expected, and the ceremony proceeded toward its inevitable conclusion. The vows approached like a sentence being pronounced, and Eleanor gripped her prayer book until her knuckles whitened, and Aunt Catherine's hand found hers in the folds of her skirt, a silent anchor as the vicar asked Frederick to repeat the words that would seal his fate, to take this woman as his lawfully wedded wife. And Frederick opened his mouth to speak the name that would end everything, and what emerged in the hushed and holy space was not Lydia at all, but Eleanor, the name spoken with such clarity and conviction that it echoed off the ancient stones and stopped every heart in the congregation. The silence that followed Frederick's utterance of Eleanor's name stretched into an eternity that seemed to suspend the very dust motes floating in the colored light streaming through the stained glass windows. And then the church erupted into chaos as Mrs. Tkos Ashworth let out a shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, while Lydia stood frozen at the altar with her mouth open in an expression of such complete incomprehension that she appeared almost childlike, and Eleanor herself could not move, or breathe, or think beyond the single impossibility of what had just occurred, the sound of her own name still reverberating through her bones like the final chord of some magnificent symphony she had never expected to hear. Frederick turned from the altar then, turned fully to face the congregation, and specifically to find Eleanor in the family pew, and his grey eyes held such desperate hope and such profound relief that she understood with sudden clarity that this had not been an accident or a slip of the tongue, but a deliberate choice, a declaration made in the most public and irrevocable manner possible. And when he began to walk toward her down the aisle he had just traversed in the opposite direction, the guests parted before him like water before a ship's prow, too stunned to do anything but make way for this unprecedented breach of every social convention they had ever known. Lydia's voice finally found purchase, a high, keening wail of humiliation and rage that might have shattered glass had it continued, but their mother was already pulling her away from the altar while their father stood rooted to his spot, looking between his daughters with the bewildered expression of a man who had somehow wandered into someone else's life. And through it all, Frederick kept walking until he stood before Eleanor's pew and extended his hand to her with the same quiet certainty he had shown when he first sought her in the library nearly a year ago. She should refuse him, Eleanor knew, should maintain the dignity she had cultivated in Bath, and walk away from this disaster that would destroy her sister and scandalize her family, and provide gossip fodder for the county for decades to come. But when she looked into Frederick's eyes, she saw everything she had forbidden herself to want reflected back at her, saw a future that included partnership and passion and being truly seen by another soul. And before she could think better of it, her hand was rising to meet his, her fingers closing around his warm palm as he drew her to her feet. Aunt Catherine's quiet voice came from beside her, steady and calm amid the pandemonium, telling her to go with him, to take this chance that life had so unexpectedly offered. And Eleanor found herself walking down the aisle beside Frederick, walking past the scandalized faces and the whispered exclamations and Lydia's theatrical sobbing, walking toward the church doors that stood open to the grey October sky, where the first drops of rain were beginning to fall like a blessing or a baptism. And she did not look back, because everything she wanted was walking beside her, holding her hand with a grip that promised never to let go. Frederick's carriage waited at the church gate, the horses stamping impatiently in the light rain as he handed Eleanor up into the shelter of the enclosed cabin and followed close behind, pulling the door shut against the sounds of chaos still emanating from within St. Michael's, where his abandoned bride wept in her mother's arms, and society matrons clutched their pearls in scandalized delight at having witnessed the most dramatic wedding disruption in county history. And as the carriage lurched into motion, Eleanor found herself pressed against Frederick's side in the intimate space, her hand still clasped in his, as though he feared she might dissolve like morning mist if he released her for even a moment. Neither spoke as the carriage rattled down the lane away from the church, away from the wreckage of expectations and the ruins of a union that should never have been contemplated. And Eleanor could hear her own heart pounding in the silence, could feel the warmth of Frederick's body beside her, and the gentle pressure of his thumb stroking across her knuckles, in a gesture so tender it brought fresh tears to her eyes that she had thought emptied hours ago when she dressed her sister's hair and said goodbye to hope. It was Frederick who broke the silence first, his voice rough with emotion as he turned to face her in the grey light filtering through the rain-streaked windows, telling her that he had written her 47 letters during her months in Bath, 47 attempts to explain what he had realized too late, 47 declarations that he had never sent because he believed he had forfeited any right to her consideration when he proposed to Lydia, while his heart belonged entirely elsewhere, and Eleanor listened with wonder as he described the torture of those months, the hollow performance of an engaged man preparing for a wedding he dreaded with every fibre of his being. The carriage was carrying them toward Ravenscroft Hall, Frederick explained, where his household staff awaited a new mistress and where they could find sanctuary from the storm of gossip that would engulf the county by nightfall. And Eleanor realized with dawning amazement that he had planned this, had prepared for this outcome, had made arrangements for exactly this moment when he would finally claim the woman he loved before God, and witnesses, even if those witnesses had expected him to speak a different name entirely. She asked him why he had done it in such a public and irrevocable manner when he could have simply broken the engagement quietly. And Frederick's answer came with a conviction that stole her breath, explaining that he wanted there to be no doubt, no whisper of ambiguity, no possibility that anyone could ever question the depth and certainty of his choice, and that speaking her name at the altar was not a mistake, but a declaration. The truest words he had ever spoken in his life, the name that had been written on his heart since the moment he heard her play Beethoven in a snowlit ballroom, and knew that he had found something rare and precious, and worth defying every convention to possess. Ravenscroft Hall rose before them through the grey curtain of rain, its ancient stones softened by mist into something that looked more like a dream than a dwelling, and Eleanor pressed her face to the carriage window, like a child seeing the sea for the first time, drinking in the sight of this place that Frederick called home, this estate that he was offering to share with her, despite the ruin they had left behind them at the church. And when the carriage rolled to a stop beneath the great portico, she could see servants lined up in the entrance hall, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes bright with curiosity about the woman their master had chosen in such spectacular fashion over the beautiful golden girl everyone had expected to become their mistress. Frederick handed her down from the carriage with such tender care that fresh tears pricked at her eyes, and he tucked her hand into the crook of his arm as he led her up the steps and into Ravenscroft Hall, introducing her to the housekeeper and the butler with a simple declaration that Miss Ashworth would be staying as his honoured guest until arrangements could be made for their marriage. And Eleanor heard the sharp intake of breath from the older servants who understood exactly what had transpired that morning, who recognized the scandal implicit in this unconventional arrival. But she also saw the way they looked at Frederick with something like relief, as though they had feared for their master's happiness and now saw hope restored. The house itself was beautiful, in a way that spoke of centuries of careful stewardship, of generations who had loved these rooms and tended these gardens, and filled these halls with music and laughter and occasionally with tears. And Frederick walked her through the principal rooms with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with wealth or status, and everything to do with belonging, with history, with the weight of all the lives that had been lived within these walls. And when they reached the library, Eleanor stopped in the doorway and simply stared at the thousands of volumes lining the walls from floor to ceiling, at the comfortable chairs arranged before the fireplace, at the pianoforte standing in the corner by the window where afternoon light would fall across the keys, and she understood that Frederick had brought her here deliberately, had wanted this room to be the first to truly welcome her, because he knew she would see it as sanctuary, as home, as the physical manifestation of everything they had recognized in each other that snowy night nearly a year ago when she played Beethoven and he quoted Marcus Aurelius, and something irrevocable began between them. He told her that the pianoforte had belonged to his mother, that it had stood silent since her death because he could not bear to hear anyone else play it, but that he wanted Eleanor to fill this house with music again, wanted to hear Beethoven echoing through these halls and know that the woman he loved was the one coaxing beauty from those ivory keys. And Eleanor wept then, wept openly and without shame for all the months of suppressed longing, and all the hope she had forbidden herself, and all the impossible joy that was somehow becoming her reality. The days that followed existed in a strange suspension between scandal and sanctuary, between the world they had left behind and the future they were only beginning to imagine. And Eleanor found herself wandering the halls of Ravenscroft like a woman in a dream, half expecting to wake and find herself back in her narrow bed at Ashworth House with nothing but memory to sustain her through another grey morning of invisibility and quiet desperation. Frederick seemed to understand her need for gentleness, for time to absorb the magnitude of what had transpired, and he gave her space to explore his home and his library and his gardens, while remaining always within reach, always ready with a quiet word or a warm glance, or the simple gift of his presence when she needed reassurance that this impossible happiness was real and lasting, and not some cruel trick of fate designed to raise her hopes only to dash them more thoroughly than before. Letters began arriving on the third day, first a trickle and then a flood, some addressed to Frederick in outraged script from society, matrons demanding explanations, others addressed to Eleanor in her mother's furious hand accusing her of deliberately stealing her sister's happiness through witchcraft or seduction or some other dark art that Mrs. Ashworth's limited imagination could conjure, and Frederick intercepted them all before Eleanor could read them, building a small bonfire in his study fireplace and feeding the poison to the flames, while Eleanor watched with mingled gratitude and guilt for the rift she had caused in her family. But not all the correspondence brought pain, for on the 5th day Aunt Catherine's carriage rolled up the drive bearing that magnificent woman herself, her face wreathed in triumphant smiles as she swept into Ravenscroft Hall and gathered Eleanor into an embrace that smelled of lavender and love and vindication, declaring that she had known from the Christmas ball that Frederick Sinclair was no fool despite his unfortunate detour through the murky waters of duty and expectation, and that Eleanor deserved every happiness that was finally coming her way after years of being overlooked by a family too blind to see the treasure in their midst. Lord Beaumont arrived with Aunt Catherine, having escorted her from Bath with tales of the scandal spreading through every drawing-room in England and growing more dramatic with each retelling until the story bore little resemblance to truth but made for excellent entertainment over tea and cards. And Eleanor found herself laughing for the first time since the wedding. Found herself surrounded by people who loved her and championed her and saw her exactly as Frederick did. Not as the plain elder sister or the spinster on the shelf, but as a woman worthy of devotion and grand gestures, and a love story that would be whispered about for generations. Frederick watched her laughing with her aunt and his friend, watched the color return to her cheeks and the light return to her eyes, and Eleanor caught him, watching with an expression of such profound relief and joy that she understood he had been as afraid as she was, afraid that the world would succeed in dimming what had blazed between them, afraid that doubt and guilt would poison the garden before the first flower could bloom. The wedding preparations continued despite the scandal, though now they were preparations for an entirely different bride. And Frederick threw himself into securing the special license with the same single-minded determination he had shown when he spoke Eleanor's name at the altar instead of Lydia's, refusing to allow society's disapproval or bureaucratic obstacles to delay the union that should have happened months ago. If only he had possessed the courage to follow his heart instead of his duty. Aunt Catherine appointed herself chief architect of what she called the Redemption Wedding, declaring that Eleanor would not slink into marriage like a thief ashamed of her prize, but would instead walk down the aisle of Ravenscroft's private chapel in a gown of ivory silk that Aunt Catherine had commissioned from Bath's finest modiste, in anticipation of exactly this outcome. And Eleanor laughed through her tears at her aunt's admission that she had ordered the dress months ago after watching Frederick watch Eleanor at the Christmas ball and recognizing what neither of them had yet understood about themselves. The days took on a quality of golden unreality as the household prepared for a celebration that felt less like a social obligation and more like a homecoming, with servants who had initially been cautious warming to Eleanor as they witnessed the transformation in their master, the way he smiled now without that shadow of melancholy behind his eyes, the way he laughed freely and sought Eleanor's company with undisguised joy instead of guilty furtiveness, the way he became again the man they remembered from before his mother's illness had weighted him with duty and grief. Frederick insisted on showing Eleanor every corner of the estate, walking her through gardens that would bloom in spring and orchards that would bear fruit in summer and meadows that would turn golden in autumn, painting pictures with words of all the seasons they would share together in this place that he loved so fiercely, and had feared he would never truly share with anyone who understood why it mattered. And Eleanor listened, and saw and fell more deeply in love with him with every step they took across land that would become hers to cherish alongside him. Lord Beaumont served as witness to these wanderings, often walking a discreet distance behind the couple with Aunt Catherine on his arm, and Eleanor noticed the way those two seemed to find their own connection blooming in the wake of the scandal. As though Frederick and Eleanor's unconventional love story had given them permission to explore possibilities that propriety might otherwise have forbidden. and she smiled secretly at the thought that their happiness might be contagious, might spread like the warmth of spring sunshine after a long winter of frozen hearts and buried hopes. On the evening before their wedding, Frederick led Eleanor to the library, where they had first truly seen each other, and he presented her with a small leather volume containing all the letters he had written her during the months of separation, letters he had never sent because he believed he had no right to burden her with feelings he thought he could never honorably act upon. And Eleanor read them by candlelight while Frederick watched her face and saw every emotion he had poured onto those pages reflected in her luminous brown eyes.